One second it's absurd. The next, it's a catastrophe. These 31 disasters all had a moment where someone, somewhere, was almost laughing. Then they weren't. One, a giant wave of molasses, sounds like the punchline to a joke nobody finished. Sweet, slow, sticky. If this ever came up in a pub quiz, people would be giggling while they wrote down their answer. The real answer is that on January 15th, 1919, a storage tank containing 2.3 million gallons of molasses, owned by United States Industrial Alcohol, exploded without warning in Boston's North End neighborhood, and what followed was not funny in any sense that a reasonable person would recognize. The wave reached an estimated 8 to 15 feet tall and traveled at 35 miles per hour, which is faster than most people can sprint, even when they are not running directly into a wall of sugar. Horses were engulfed. Firefighters were engulfed. People who had been walking to work on a Tuesday morning were engulfed before they had time to process what was happening. The molasses then did something particularly cruel. It cooled in the January air, thickening around victims who were still alive, turning rescue into something closer to archaeology. First responders described the process of pulling people free as extracting them from a substance that had decided to become solid at the worst possible moment. 21 people died. 150 were injured. Buildings were demolished. An elevated railway structure was destroyed. The cleanup took weeks and required the city to pump salt water from the harbor onto the streets. Here is the detail that puts the whole thing in context. The tank had been known to leak for years. Workers had been scraping residue off the outside of it and eating it because management refused to respond to maintenance complaints. The company's official response after the explosion was to blame anarchists rather than acknowledge that they had been operating a structurally compromised 2 million gallon tank in a densely populated neighborhood. The disaster ultimately led to stronger structural engineering regulations in Massachusetts, which is the government's way of saying they needed a river of molasses and 21 deaths before anyone wrote down the rule that tanks should not leak. Local residents reportedly claimed they could still smell it on hot summer days for decades. The most uniquely Boston ending to a story that has ever existed. 2. Hundreds of people spontaneously dancing in the streets of a medieval city sounds like a charming historical footnote, a communal outburst of joy, possibly the world's first flash mob. You picture cobblestones, loots, everyone having a wonderful unscripted moment before returning to their regular lives of grinding poverty and avoiding the plague. Here is what actually happened in Strasbourg in July of 1518. A woman named Frau Trophea began dancing alone in the street and could not stop. Within 1 week, 34 people had joined her. Within a month, the number had climbed to approximately 400, and the word dancing is doing enormous work in that sentence because what was happening bore little resemblance to anything celebratory. Victims reported that they could not stop. They danced through the night. They danced through exhaustion. They danced until their feet bled through their shoes, until they broke bones, until they dislocated joints, until their hearts gave out. Contemporary physician records and city council documents confirm this happened. This is not folklore. This is a bureaucratically documented medical catastrophe, which makes it considerably more disturbing than if it were just a legend. The city's response was extraordinary in its wrongness. Officials initially believed that more dancing would cure the affliction, so they hired musicians and professional dancers to accompany the victims, essentially providing a soundtrack to a mass medical emergency. Dozens of people died from cardiac events, strokes, and pure physical exhaustion. The city eventually moved the dancers to a mountaintop shrine, at which point the episode stopped, which tells researchers a great deal about the role of environment and social reinforcement in sustaining it. Modern explanations include mass psychogenic illness, ergot fungus poisoning from contaminated grain causing convulsions and hallucinations, or a collective physiological collapse under years of accumulated famine and disease stress. None of these theories are fully settled. The event remains the most thoroughly documented case of epidemic dancing behavior in recorded history and is actively studied in medical and sociological literature on mass psychogenic illness. The city of Strasbourg hired musicians to play for people who were dying of dancing. The response to a public health catastrophe was to make it louder. History's most on-brand example of authorities making an emergency worse by doing the most intuitive possible thing. 3. A beached whale is sad, obviously, but it is also a logistical problem, and logistical problems have solutions. Someone calls wildlife services. An expert arrives. The situation is assessed by a person whose professional training is relevant to the situation. The whale is handled. Oregon in 1970 disagreed with this framework entirely. A 45-foot, 8-ton sperm whale washed ashore near Florence, and the state decided to put the Oregon Highway Division in charge of its removal, which is the road maintenance department, because the whale was on a state beach, and beaches are apparently adjacent enough to roads that the bureaucratic logic held together for a moment. The Highway Division engineer, with no demolition expertise, consulted briefly and arrived at the conclusion that half a ton of dynamite, specifically 20 cases of it, would vaporize the carcass into pieces small enough for seagulls to dispose of. Marine biologists who suggested this was an aggressive misunderstanding of physics were overruled. On November 12, 1970, the dynamite detonated, and the explosion flung massive chunks of decomposing whale blubber in every direction across a radius of several hundred feet. Spectators who had driven from considerable distances to watch had not positioned themselves at a range that accounted for the trajectory of bus-sized pieces of rotting cetacean. One piece of debris, the approximate size of a car hood, landed directly on a brand new Oldsmobile, parked in what had been designated the safe viewing area, and destroyed it completely. The footage of the event was recorded by journalist Paul Linman of K2 and sat largely forgotten for decades before resurfacing in the early 1990s and becoming one of the first genuinely viral videos on the early internet. The majority of the whale carcass remained substantially intact after the detonation. Authorities then buried what remained, which was the precise solution that marine biologists had recommended before anyone introduced explosives to the conversation. No humans were killed, which, given the actual physics of what occurred that afternoon, is a more impressive outcome than it sounds. The lesson extracted from this event is not, as one might assume, do not use military-grade explosives on marine mammals. The lesson is more specific. When the person with relevant expertise says do not use military-grade explosives on a marine mammal, the correct response is to not use military-grade explosives on a marine mammal. 4. A flood of free beer sounds like the setup to a story that ends with everyone toasting each other and nobody being harmed in any meaningful way. Streets running with ale, a neighborhood discovering an unexpected windfall, the most cheerful possible municipal emergency. On October 17, 1814, at the Moo & Company Brewery on Tottenham Court Road in London, a fermentation vat containing approximately 100,000 gallons of beer broke its retaining hoop, which triggered a cascade failure of surrounding vats in a sequence that released approximately 1.2 million pints of beer into the surrounding streets simultaneously. 8 people drowned. A 9th died days afterward from fever. Several more died from alcohol poisoning in the aftermath, having attempted to collect and consume what the streets were offering. The neighborhood the flood destroyed was St. Giles, which was one of London's most densely packed slum districts, and many of its residents lived in basement rooms that filled within seconds of the wave arriving. People who had been asleep or sitting at ground level had no meaningful opportunity to reach exits or upper floors. The death toll was concentrated among those who had the least structural protection, which is the consistent geometry of almost every disaster in this list. The brewery subsequently appeared in court and argued successfully that the event constituted an act of God, a legal classification that exempted them from paying damages or taxes on the lost product. The victims of the flood received no compensation. This outcome, the company walking away from an event that killed 8 of their neighbors without financial consequence, was not considered remarkable at the time because the legal framework for industrial liability simply did not yet exist in a form that would have produced a different result. The event contributed to growing public conversation about the relationship between industrial operations and the communities surrounding them, which is a very dignified way of noting that it took a neighborhood full of drowned people to get anyone to ask whether breweries should be accountable for what they spill. 8 people drowned in beer in the middle of London. The company invoked divine responsibility, and the century moved on without materially changing the conditions that made it possible. 5. Mass psychogenic illness does not sound like something that sends hundreds of people to the hospital with measurable physiological symptoms arising from absolutely no physical cause, and yet that is precisely what it does, repeatedly, across cultures, across centuries, across every demographic category researchers have examined. It is classified by the World Health Organization. It is documented in peer-reviewed medical literature. It is not, to be clear, people pretending. The symptoms are neurologically genuine. The fainting is real. The difficulty breathing is real. The seizure-like convulsions are real. The cause is not a pathogen or a toxin. The cause is information, specifically frightening information spreading through a social group faster than individuals can process it. In 1998, a teacher at a Tennessee high school reported detecting a gasoline smell. Within hours, 100 students and 19 staff members had been hospitalized with headaches, nausea, and respiratory symptoms. Environmental testing of the building found nothing. No gas, no chemical contaminant, no organic cause of any kind. Investigators noted that the pattern of symptom spread followed social network lines precisely. Those most closely connected to the initial reported victims were most likely to develop symptoms next. The 1998 case is one of dozens in the published literature. The 2011 to 2012 episode in Leroy, New York involved 18 high school students developing uncontrollable tics and verbal outbursts so severe that national media covered the story extensively. Extensive neurological and environmental testing found no organic cause. The diagnosis of mass psychogenic illness was met with fierce public resistance because the symptoms were physically severe and the students were visibly suffering. Both things were true simultaneously, which is the part of this phenomenon that most people find impossible to integrate. Treatment protocols typically involve separating affected individuals from one another, which breaks the visual feedback loop sustaining the episode. Informing sufferers that their symptoms are psychogenic in origin frequently makes the episode worse rather than better, which tells you something about the mechanism involved. The human nervous system will produce genuine, measurable, physically real symptoms from the perception of threat alone, without any physical agent present. The most dangerous thing in that Tennessee school building was the idea that something dangerous was in the building. 6. A promotional lottery run by a major soft drink company is about as unthreatening a corporate activity as exists. Collect bottle caps, check numbers, win prizes, feel briefly positive about a brand that sells carbonated sugar water. Pepsi Philippines launched exactly this in 1992, called it Number Fever, and offered prizes up to 1 million pesos, which was approximately 40,000 US dollars at the time, and represented life-changing money for most Filipino households. The winning number for the grand prize was announced as 349. Due to a processing error made by the contracted security firm handling the promotion, approximately 800,000 bottle caps had been printed with the number 349 as a designated non-winning safe number. Every single one of those caps was now, technically, a winning cap. Pepsi's theoretical payout liability was approximately $32 billion, a figure that exceeded the entire annual GDP of the Philippines at the time by a significant margin. Pepsi's response was to offer 500 pesos per winning cap, which converted to roughly 18 US dollars. The public's response to being offered $18 instead of 40,000 was not measured or restrained. Riots broke out. Pepsi delivery trucks were attacked with Molotov cocktails. Bottling plants were targeted. Grenades were thrown at company facilities. At least 5 people were confirmed killed in the violence. Dozens more were injured. Over 3,000 criminal complaints were filed against Pepsi executives by individual claimants. The legal proceedings continued for years. Philippine courts ultimately ruled largely in Pepsi's favor, determining the error constituted a void contract, which meant the company that had printed 800,000 winning bottle caps and then refused to honor them faced minimal legal consequence. The case became a landmark study in marketing law, contract theory, and what happens when a corporation accidentally promises $32 billion to a population that genuinely needed the money and then offers $18 as a substitute. Pepsi accidentally created the conditions for a civil insurrection over a bottle cap promotion, offered the functional equivalent of bus fare as resolution, and expressed visible surprise at the grenades. Some gaps in institutional self-awareness are simply too wide to bridge with a press release. 7. An outbreak of laughter at a boarding school sounds like the kind of story a headmistress tells with faint exasperation at a faculty meeting. Someone told a joke at the wrong moment. Things escalated. The students eventually settled down. Everyone wrote a strongly worded letter home to the parents. On January 30th, 1962, 3 students at a girls' boarding school in Kashasha, in what is now Tanzania, began laughing uncontrollably. The episode spread through the school until 95 of the 159 students were affected. The school was forced to close on March 18th. That was not the end of it. It was the beginning. When students returned to their home villages, the episode traveled with them. Over the following 18 months, the laughter epidemic spread across 14 schools and several villages, affecting an estimated 1,000 people before it stopped. The word laughter is carrying too much cheerful weight in that sentence. Affected individuals did not simply giggle at inconvenient moments. They experienced fainting, flatulence, respiratory distress, rashes, crying, and screaming alongside the laughter. Several schools had to close entirely. The episode lasted a year and a half. Medical investigations found no toxic, infectious, or neurological organic cause. The event is now classified as the most extensively documented case of mass psychogenic illness in the 20th century and appears in the International Journal of Social Psychiatry. Researchers including Dr. Robert Bartholomew, who wrote the primary academic analysis, have identified the social context as central. Tanganyika had achieved independence from British rule in 1961. The schools were mission-run institutions with rigid discipline structures, and the affected students were living under conditions of significant cultural disruption and psychological stress. The treatment that worked was isolation, removing affected individuals from the social environment where symptoms were spreading, broke the transmission chain, and resolved the episode for each individual. A school full of laughing students closed 14 institutions across an entire region of a newly independent country, and the mechanism was purely social. No pathogen, no toxin, no organism, just the human nervous system doing something extraordinary under pressure, and then doing it again, and then doing it for 18 months straight. 8. Deploying military machine guns against a population of large flightless birds sounds like the premise of a comedy that nobody greenlit because the pitch was too absurd. The Australian military disagreed with this assessment in 1932 when approximately 20,000 emus were migrating through the Campion district of Western Australia and destroying wheat crops that were already struggling under Depression-era economic conditions. Farmers, many of them World War I veterans, appealed to the government for assistance. Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was dispatched with 2 soldiers, 2 Lewis guns, and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. The first engagement on November 2nd was a comprehensive failure. The emus scattered into small groups before the guns could be brought into effective range. The Lewis guns jammed repeatedly. Fewer than a dozen birds were killed in what had been planned as a decisive opening operation. Over the following weeks, Meredith pursued the emus across the countryside and filed operational reports to the Australian Parliament that are preserved in the National Archives and constitute some of the most entertainingly defeated military documents in Southern Hemisphere history. His assessment that the emus could face machine guns with, in his words, the invulnerability of tanks is now quoted in historical literature, with the frequency usually reserved for significant military theorists. He also compared them to Zulus, whom even expanding bullets could not stop, which suggests the emus had made a significant impression on him. The military officially withdrew from the operation twice. The total kill rate across the entire campaign was approximately 986 birds per 10,000 rounds of ammunition, a ratio that military historians have compared unfavorably to almost any other documented combat operation in Australian history. The emus continued their migration on their historical routes the following year. The Australian government eventually addressed the crop destruction through a bounty system managed by local hunters, which proved substantially more effective than machine guns and also did not require a parliamentary filing when it failed. The episode is documented in the Australian Parliamentary Record and the National Archives in enough detail to confirm that this is not embellished. The emus won. The military filed paperwork explaining why. 9. Taking children to the circus on a summer afternoon is the most structurally wholesome activity a parent can plan. There is no threat category associated with cotton candy and acrobats. On July 6, 1944, somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people were inside the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, main tent in Hartford, Connecticut, when a fire started near the entrance. The tent burned completely in approximately 8 minutes. 167 people died, the majority of them children and women, primarily from crushing and trampling rather than from the fire itself, because the exits were inadequate for the crowd attempting to use them simultaneously. The detail that explains the speed of what happened. The tent's waterproofing was a mixture of white gasoline and paraffin wax. The canvas was coated in fuel. The detail that explains why people could not get out. The big cat runways, the metal chutes used to move lions and tigers between their cages and the performance ring, were still in position and blocked 2 of the main exits, funneling thousands of panicking people into bottlenecks from which many of them did not emerge. 7 circus officials were convicted of involuntary manslaughter. The disaster produced sweeping new fire safety regulations for public assemblies across the United States, including mandatory fire-resistant materials for temporary structures and regulated exit requirements. Among the dead was a 6-year-old girl who was never identified and became known as Little Miss 1565. Her case remained open for over 50 years. A 1991 investigation suggested a possible identity that was never conclusively confirmed, meaning she remained officially unidentified for more than half a century after the fire. The waterproofing decision is the part of this story that keeps demanding attention. Someone looked at a tent full of children and selected a coating made of gasoline. That decision required a federal law to prevent from being repeated. The Hartford Circus Fire remains the deadliest fire in Connecticut history and is taught in fire safety engineering as an example of how multiple individually correctable failures combine into a single outcome that is not correctable at all. 10. A chemical leak at a pesticide factory in a mid-sized Indian city sounds like a regional industrial incident. A regulatory failure. A serious local emergency with significant but contained consequences. The Bhopal disaster of December 2nd and 3rd, 1984, was none of those things. The Union Carbide India Limited plant released approximately 40 tons of methyl isocyanate gas into the surrounding city of approximately 900,000 people when water entered a storage tank, triggering a violent chemical reaction. The exact cause remains disputed. The company's position was sabotage. Independent investigators and the Indian government concluded the cause was negligent safety procedures combined with multiple non-operational safety systems. Methyl isocyanate gas is heavier than air. It did not rise and disperse. It settled at ground level and flowed through the streets of the neighborhoods immediately surrounding the plant, which were densely packed residential slums. Victims woke unable to breathe, with burning eyes and skin. Many died where they lay. Others fled and collapsed in the streets. The Indian Council of Medical Research recorded 3,787 immediate deaths. Later, government affidavits cited figures between 15,000 and 16,000 total deaths attributable to the disaster, including those who died in the following weeks and years from respiratory disease, cancer, neurological damage, and complications that have persisted in the affected population through the present day. Union Carbide's own scientists had been operating under extensive protective measures, while workers at the plant were told the materials they were handling were harmless. Internal documents examined after the disaster confirmed knowledge of risk had been suppressed. Warren Anderson, Union Carbide's CEO, was charged with culpable homicide by Indian authorities, arrested during a visit to India, released on bail, and never extradited. He died in Florida in 2014 without standing trial. The settlement paid to victims in 1989 totaled approximately $470 million, averaging roughly $550 per affected person. The site has never been fully remediated. Soil and groundwater testing conducted between 2002 and 2012 found toxic compounds at levels hundreds of times above safe thresholds. 40 years after the leak, the poison is still in the ground under a city that was never cleaned up, and the executive responsible died, having never faced a criminal court. 11. Young women in the 1920s being paid to paint watch dials with glowing paint. Sounds like a peculiar but relatively benign industrial job. Luminous dials were a technological novelty. The work was considered skilled and paid better than most options available to young women at the time. The United States Radium Corporation in Orange, New Jersey, employed hundreds of women to apply radium-based luminescent paint to clock and watch faces, and instructed them to lip point their brushes, placing the tip in their mouths to form a fine point, sometimes hundreds of times per day. Radium, when ingested, behaves chemically like calcium. The body cannot distinguish between them. It deposits radium directly into bone tissue, where it irradiates from the inside continuously, with no metabolic mechanism available to remove it. Within a few years of beginning work, women started losing teeth, not in the ordinary sense, but spontaneously, without decay, in ways that dentists had no framework to explain. When dentists attempted to extract other teeth, the jawbones crumbled, holes formed in bones, tumors appeared, anemia developed. Some workers' bones became sufficiently radioactive that they glowed in darkened rooms. The company was fully aware of radium's dangers. Their own scientists were taking extensive precautions, while workers were told the paint was harmless. Internal documents confirmed later that knowledge of the risk had been deliberately suppressed to protect production. A group of the affected workers brought a lawsuit in 1927, facing tremendous legal and financial pressure from the company to settle without publicity. The case established the legal precedent that employers bear liability for occupational disease, a principle that did not yet have firm standing in American courts. 5 of the original plaintiffs settled in 1928, each receiving $10,000 and ongoing medical expenses. Most died from radiation-related illness within a few years of the settlement. The last surviving plaintiff died in 1938. The case is credited by labor historians as foundational to the modern framework of workplace safety rights in the United States. They were told to put a radioactive substance in their mouths hundreds of times daily by a company whose own researchers were in protective equipment in the next building. What they built from that betrayal is the legal infrastructure that protects every worker who has come after them. 12. A disagreement between a religious community and local politicians in a small Oregon town sounds like the driest possible local government conflict. Zoning disputes, noise complaints, strongly worded letters at public meetings. The conflict between the Rajneeshi commune at Rajneeshpuram in Wasco County, Oregon, and local elected officials in 1984 was not that. Members of the commune's inner circle, under the direction of Ma and Sheila, cultured Salmonella typhimurium bacteria in a clandestine laboratory built within the commune's own facilities, with the operational goal of incapacitating enough local voters before a county commissioner election to alter the outcome. The pathogen was then applied covertly to salad bars at 10 local restaurants in the Dalles, Oregon. 751 people were confirmed infected. 45 required hospitalization. The Oregon Health Division's initial investigation treated the outbreak as a conventional food safety failure, looking for contamination in food handling procedures, and found nothing conclusive. The deliberate origin was not identified for over a year. The investigation ultimately succeeded because the commune's own internal power structure collapsed. Sheila and other senior leadership fled to Europe following a dispute within the commune, and a subsequent investigation of the commune's facilities revealed the laboratory, biological cultures, and internal audio recordings documenting the planning of the attack. 2 individuals were convicted on assault charges and sentenced to 20 years in federal prison. Both served less than 3 years before release. The case is the first and largest bioterrorism attack in United States history and is a required case study in public health emergency planning programs nationally. The fact that it was not identified as deliberate for over a year is the specific detail that drove the most significant policy changes, because it revealed that public health infrastructure at the time had no framework for even considering intentional contamination as a hypothesis when investigating an outbreak. 751 people were deliberately poisoned to influence a local election. The perpetrators served under 3 years. The most alarming detail in that sequence is debatable, and different people who study this case professionally disagree about which one it is. 13. A busy Saturday night at a popular Boston nightclub in November of 1942. Big band music, a packed house, one small incident involving a decorative artificial palm tree in a basement lounge, and a 16-year-old busboy who lit a match to see while replacing a light bulb. The artificial palm ignited. The fire moved through the Coconut Grove nightclub's interior so fast that multiple witnesses described the transition from normal to catastrophic as essentially instantaneous. The interior was covered in flammable decorative fabric, artificial leather wall treatments, and cloth ceiling coverings that carried fire across the entire venue in seconds. The club held an estimated 1,000 people that night, against a legal capacity of approximately 460. The main entrance featured a single revolving door. As panicking crowds pressed into it from both sides simultaneously, it jammed, and the majority of those who died near the entrance were crushed or asphyxiated in the resulting bottleneck rather than burned. Several exits were hidden behind drapery, locked, or unknown to patrons. One section of the club had a single narrow exit stairway serving the entire area. 492 people died. The disaster occurred while Boston's hospitals were already operating on wartime emergency footing, and the medical community's response to the sudden influx of severe burn victims directly accelerated development of burn treatment protocols that were subsequently applied to military casualties in the remaining years of the war. Fluid resuscitation therapy, the standard approach to treating burn patients, was refined under pressure from Coconut Grove's victims. The owner, Barnett Wilansky, was convicted of involuntary manslaughter and sentenced to 12 to 15 years. He served approximately 3 before being pardoned due to terminal illness and died shortly after release. The Coconut Grove fire generated the most sweeping set of fire safety code revisions in American municipal history to that point, including the requirement that exit doors open outward. That requirement, born from 492 deaths in a basement nightclub, has saved an uncountable number of lives in every public building constructed since. A fake palm tree, a match, and a revolving door. The outcome was legislation that is still protecting people right now. 14. Crowd crush is consistently described by witnesses in the immediate vicinity of fatalities as exciting and energetic, which is the single most important and most consistently ignored fact in public safety. At high crowd density, a group of people stops behaving like a collection of individuals and starts behaving like a fluid. Pressure waves move through the crowd faster than individuals can perceive or respond to them. When density reaches approximately 6 to 7 people per square meter, the compressive force on any individual's chest becomes sufficient to prevent breathing, regardless of whether that person is standing upright, conscious, and attempting to move. Victims frequently report feeling lifted off their feet entirely, unable to raise their arms, unable to understand what is happening to them. This condition, compressive asphyxia, produces death with no external sign of injury. In 1979, 11 people were killed outside a concert venue in Cincinnati in a crowd compression event before the doors opened, while others were still purchasing merchandise nearby. Witnesses adjacent to the area where people were dying described the crowd as dancing. In 1989, 97 people died by compressive asphyxia at a football match in Sheffield, England. Police initially reported a riot. There was no riot. There was a standing section filled beyond safe capacity, while people stood still and suffocated while the crowd in adjacent sections watched what appeared to be a normally enthusiastic match atmosphere. In 2021, 10 people died at a music festival in Houston in a crowd compression event where emergency services initially treated the reported collapses as drug incidents, delaying the response that the situation actually required. Crowd safety researcher Professor Keith Still has documented that in virtually every crowd crush fatality event, Witnesses close to the victims described the scene as appearing energetic or exciting until the moment of collapse. The visual threshold between a crowd approaching lethal density and a crowd having an excellent time is not detectable by human observation alone. The most dangerous crowd is not the one that looks dangerous. It looks exactly like everyone is having the time of their life. 15. In 1897, a hydrogen balloon expedition from Norway to the North Pole was considered the most ambitious and glamorous adventure a human being could undertake. The press coverage was global. The participants were credentialed scientists. The technology was state-of-the-art. Swedish engineer Salomon August André and two companions departed from Svalbard on July 11, 1987, and contact was lost almost immediately. Their fate was unknown for 33 years. In 1930, a Norwegian scientific expedition to White Island, known as Kvitoya, discovered the camp, equipment, remains, and undeveloped photographic film belonging to the André expedition. The film was successfully developed and produced clear images of the three men after their landing on the ice, smiling, apparently in reasonable condition, entirely unaware of how close they were to dying. André's diaries, also recovered intact, revealed the balloon had come down after approximately 65 hours of flight, having traveled roughly 475 miles. The three men then walked across pack ice toward land for months. They reached White Island in October of 1897 and died there within days of arrival. The cause of death was debated by researchers for decades. The most strongly supported current theory, advanced in a 1952 medical analysis and subsequently supported by food scientists, is trichinosis from undercooked polar bear meat. Trichinella parasites are endemic to polar bears in that region. The men's documented diet and the symptoms described in the final diary entries are consistent with the disease. The photographs recovered from the expedition site are among the most haunting documents in the history of exploration. Three men smiling on the ice in conditions that would kill them within weeks, with a camera that would outlast everyone who knew what it was for by 33 years. André and his companions were not reckless. They were the most prepared people their era could produce for what they were attempting. What they were attempting simply had requirements their era did not yet understand. 16. Nitrous oxide parties in late 18th century England were a fashionable entertainment for the aristocracy and scientific community alike. Attendees would inhale the gas and stumble around laughing at each other in drawing rooms, while servants watched with expressions that history has mercifully not preserved. In 1799, a 20-year-old chemist named Humphrey Davy at the Pneumatic Institution in Bristol began systematic experimentation with the compound. He documented that nitrous oxide eliminated pain. He wrote it down. He published it in 1800 in a work titled Researches, Chemical and Philosophical, and stated explicitly that the gas may probably be used with advantage during surgical operations. Nobody acted on this. The primary context in which nitrous oxide was encountered by the scientific community and the general public was the laughing gas party, and the recreational context completely overwhelmed the clinical observation. For approximately 50 years after Davy's explicit published recommendation, surgery was performed without anesthesia. Patients were held down by assistants. They were given alcohol or opium at most. They were operated on while fully conscious and aware of every detail of what was happening to them. Surgical speed was prized above almost every other professional quality in a surgeon, because the faster the operation, the shorter the period of conscious suffering. Ether anesthesia was not introduced into surgical practice until 1846, when American dentist William Morton demonstrated it publicly at Massachusetts General Hospital. Chloroform followed shortly after. The 46-year gap between Davy's written recommendation and the adoption of surgical anesthesia is studied in the history of medicine as a translational failure, a scenario in which a critical scientific insight was encountered in the wrong context and filed away under entertainment rather than medicine. The number of patients who experienced preventable conscious suffering during surgery in that window is estimated conservatively in the tens of thousands. Davy moved on to other research and never directly pursued the application of his own finding. He published the solution to one of medicine's most pressing problems, attended several more parties, and the operating tables stayed exactly as they were. 17. a passenger steamship rolling onto its side while still tied to the dock in a Chicago river. Before it goes anywhere, while it is stationary, at a dock, in 20 feet of water, while people stand on shore and watch. This is the geometry of the SS Eastland disaster on July 24th, 1915, which killed 848 people, a figure that is higher than the confirmed death toll of the Titanic and is remembered by approximately none of the people who can name the Titanic. The Eastland had a documented history of stability problems that predated its launch. Multiple previous incidents of listing had been recorded and reported. Engineers and inspectors had flagged the vessel's instability, and these warnings had been processed administratively and disregarded. A contributing factor with its own bitter irony, the Federal Seamen's Act of 1915, passed partly in response to the Titanic disaster, required all passenger vessels to carry additional lifeboats and safety equipment. The added weight of the newly mandated equipment on the Eastland's upper deck shifted its already precarious center of gravity. The ship was loading passengers for the Western Electric Hawthorne Works employee annual excursion. Approximately 2,500 people had boarded when the list began. At approximately 7:28 in the morning, before the vessel had moved a foot from the dock, it rolled completely onto its side. Hundreds of passengers were trapped in the enclosed lower decks, unable to reach exits before water flooded in. Many were crushed by furniture and equipment sliding in the rollover. 848 confirmed dead, because the ship capsized in shallow, murky river water at a dock in plain view of the shore. Many bodies were recovered within hours. The disaster killed 22 entire families. No one was successfully prosecuted. The Eastland disaster receives dramatically less historical attention than the Titanic by almost any measure, which historians attribute partly to the absence of first-class celebrity passengers and partly to the speed and undramatic nature of the sinking. It never moved. It just fell over. 848 people at a dock before breakfast. 18, a small underground coal seam fire, sounds like the category of industrial incident that has a known resolution timeline. Fire suppression crews are deployed. The fuel source is isolated. The situation is controlled. Centralia, Pennsylvania, had a coal seam fire ignite in 1962, most likely connected to a controlled landfill burn at a former strip mine. It is still burning. It has been burning for over 60 years. The Centralia coal seam connects to an extensive network of underground mine tunnels throughout the region. As the fire spread through this network, it became effectively impossible to extinguish through conventional means without access to every connecting passage, most of which were sealed, partially collapsed, or structurally unreachable. For years, residents reported gas fumes in basements, dying vegetation, and unusual warmth radiating from the ground. In 1981, a 12-year-old boy named Todd Domboski was walking in his grandmother's backyard when the ground beneath him opened into a steaming sinkhole approximately 150 feet deep, venting carbon monoxide. He survived by grabbing exposed tree roots. Carbon monoxide levels measured in homes throughout the town were found at levels far exceeding safe exposure thresholds. The population of Centralia, which stood at approximately 1,000 in 1962, had declined to fewer than 10 residents by 2010. The Commonwealth of Pennsylvania condemned the remaining properties. The state officially eliminated Centralia's zip code in 2002. The U.S. Postal Service delisted it. The borough's corporate charter was revoked in 2009. Geological surveys estimate the coal seam fire could continue burning for another 250 years, given the volume of accessible fuel that remains. There is no currently available technology capable of extinguishing it without essentially excavating the entire region. Centralia is widely acknowledged as a primary inspiration for the fictional town in the Silent Hill horror franchise, which, given the town's actual current condition, represents only a modest creative exaggeration. A small trash fire in 1962 is still burning under the ground where a town used to be, and the most optimistic available estimate is that it stops sometime around the 23rd century. 19. A cargo ship fire at a Texas dock in 1947. Someone calls the fire department. Professionals arrive. People maintain a safe viewing distance and watch professionals manage the situation. On April 16th, 1947, in Texas City, Texas, the French cargo ship SS Grand Camp was carrying approximately 2,300 tons of ammonium nitrate fertilizer. A fire broke out in the hold, origin undetermined, most likely from a smoldering ignition source. The captain, attempting to preserve the cargo, ordered the hold sealed and steam pumped rather than water flooded. This decision allowed heat to build in an enclosed space filled with a powerful oxidizing agent. The entire Texas City Volunteer Fire Department responded to the dock. All 28 men gathered near the ship approximately 15 minutes before it detonated at 9:12 in the morning. The explosion was heard 150 miles away. It registered as a seismic event in Denver, Colorado. The blast wave generated a 15-foot wave in the harbor, demolished the waterfront, and ignited secondary fires across the city. Every firefighter who responded, all 28, was killed almost instantly. A second ship, the SS High Flyer, also carrying ammonium nitrate, caught fire from the explosion and debris and detonated the following morning, causing additional casualties and further destruction. The confirmed death toll was 581, with estimates suggesting the actual number may exceed 600 because workers and bystanders whose remains were never recovered could not be formally included in official counts. Approximately 5,000 injuries. 1,000 buildings destroyed. The barrel of the Grand Camp's deck gun was recovered 5.6 kilometers from the detonation site. An anchor shank was found 4 kilometers away. Texas City versus United States became a landmark Supreme Court case as residents sued the federal government for negligence in regulating ammonium nitrate storage and transport following World War II. The plaintiffs ultimately did not prevail. The case established important precedents in federal tort liability that have shaped subsequent law. Every firefighter in Texas City went to a cargo ship fire and did not come back, because a fertilizer ship is one bad decision away from an explosion measured in kilotons, and that fact was not on any briefing document at the dock. 20. The River Thames smelled particularly bad in the summer of 1858 because 3 million people's raw sewage was flowing untreated into the city's primary water source and had been doing so for decades. London used the Thames as both its drinking water supply and its main sewer simultaneously, an arrangement that had already produced 3 major cholera epidemics and killed approximately 30,000 people across 1832, 1848, and 1854. Physician John Snow had mapped the 1854 Broad Street outbreak in Soho, demonstrating cholera's waterborne transmission by tracing 616 deaths in 10 days to a single contaminated pump. His findings were initially rejected because the dominant medical theory held that disease came from bad air rather than contaminated water, which meant the actual mechanism killing 30,000 people had been identified and dismissed. The summer of 1858 was unusually hot. Thames temperatures accelerated bacterial decomposition of the accumulated sewage, producing a smell so overwhelming that Parliament, which sat directly adjacent to the river, became functionally unusable. Members attempted to work behind draperies soaked in chloride of lime. The draperies did not help. This episode, known as the Great Stink, was the political crisis that compelled action. Engineer Joseph Bazalgette was commissioned to design a sewage system for the entire city. His construction covered 83 miles of brick main sewers and 1,100 miles of street sewers, supported by 2 massive pumping stations. It was one of the largest civil engineering projects of the 19th century and was completed in the 1870s. London's cholera death rate dropped immediately and permanently following completion. The city has not experienced a major cholera epidemic since. The critical detail in this sequence is that 3 epidemics killing 30,000 people generated parliamentary committees and medical debates. Politicians being unable to work in their own building for one summer generated actual infrastructure. The cure for 30,000 deaths was personal discomfort at the legislative level. Bazalgette's sewers are still in use under London today, which means a smell was the catalyst for engineering that has been protecting people for 150 years. 21. a tornado in the American Midwest in March of 1925. The National Weather Service would handle it. People would take shelter. The affected communities would rebuild. The tri-state tornado touched down in Reynolds County, Missouri at approximately 1 in the afternoon and traveled northeast through Missouri, then into Illinois, then into Indiana, maintaining continuous ground contact for the entire journey of 219 miles, a distance no subsequently recorded tornado has matched. It moved at an estimated forward speed of 60 to 73 miles per hour, which is significantly faster than most people associate with tornadoes and fast enough to overtake individuals attempting to flee by vehicle in some documented cases. In 1925, the United States Weather Bureau was officially prohibited from using the word tornado in public forecasts. The prohibition had been in place since 1887, based on the official position that using the word would cause public panic. As a result of this policy, no tornado forecast, no tornado warning, and no official communication of any kind preceded the storm's arrival in any of the communities it destroyed. The town of Murfreesboro, Illinois, lost 234 residents, the highest death toll of any single city from any tornado in American history. The town of DeSoto, Illinois, lost 69 people, including 33 children in a school building. Gorham, Illinois, lost 34. The tornado consumed community after community in a sequence that took less than 4 hours, while residents had no advance knowledge it was coming, because the government had decided knowledge would be more dangerous than ignorance. The confirmed death toll was 695. Injuries exceeded 2,000. Approximately 15,000 homes were destroyed. The government had known the word tornado for decades and had officially chosen not to use it in public communications for 38 years before this afternoon. A formal tornado warning system was not established until 1950. The prohibition on using the word tornado in forecasts intended to prevent panic produced 695 deaths in a single afternoon, while the relevant authorities had information they were prohibited from sharing. 22 in December of 2004, asteroid 99942. Apophis was calculated by NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory to have a 2.7% probability of striking Earth on April 13, 2029. On the Torino Impact Hazard Scale, which runs from 0 to 10, it received a rating of 4. It is the only object ever to reach that level. A Torino 4 rating indicates an object meriting special monitoring due to an encounter close enough to warrant concern. In practical terms, it meant a 1 in 37 chance of an impact event. For comparison, the lifetime probability of any individual dying in an automobile accident is approximately 1 in 100. A 1 in 37 chance of a civilization scale event was, by any reasonable assessment, a number that warranted more than a press release. Several senior scientists at JPL later described the 48-hour window between the initial rating and subsequent observational refinement as the only period in the history of planetary defense work when the professional assessment was that this might actually happen. Apophis is approximately 370 meters in diameter. An impact would release energy equivalent to roughly 880 megatons, approximately 65,000 Hiroshima-scale events. It would not cause a global extinction, but would devastate a region the scale of a large country and generate atmospheric and climate effects affecting the entire planet. Additional observational data collected in late December of 2004 and through January of 2005 progressively reduced the impact probability. By August of 2006, it stood at approximately 1 in 45,000. The 2029 flyby will occur at approximately 19,000 miles from Earth, below the altitude of geosynchronous satellites, and will not result in an impact. A subsequent scenario identifying a potential collision course for 2036 was also ruled out based on radar observations in 2021. The event catalyzed significant international investment in planetary defense infrastructure, including the NASA Planetary Defense Coordination Office established in 2016. For 48 hours in December of 2004, Several of the world's most qualified astronomers assessed a 1 in 37 chance that they were looking at a 25-year countdown. The rest of the world was doing Christmas shopping. The probability was revised before anyone had to decide what to tell the public. 23. A dry period in the American Midwest during the 1930s. Crops fail. Rain eventually returns. Communities recover. An agricultural setback during an already difficult decade. The Dust Bowl was not that. The southern Great Plains had been converted from native grassland to agricultural use beginning in the late 19th century, dramatically accelerating during World War I, when high wheat prices created enormous financial incentive to plow as much land as possible, as fast as possible. The native grasses that had held the topsoil in place for millennia were destroyed across millions of acres. When drought arrived in the early 1930s, the unanchored topsoil, turned to fine powder by deep plowing, was exposed to the region's characteristic high winds. The result was storms of a scale that had no historical precedent in recorded American experience. On April 14, 1935, a dust storm of sufficient intensity that it was described by witnesses as a rolling black wall, hundreds of feet tall, moved across the region, creating an instantaneous transition from daylight to total darkness in the areas it reached. The storm deposited an estimated 300,000 tons of Great Plains topsoil on Chicago. Additional dust reached the East Coast and was documented on ships 300 miles off the Atlantic shore. Dust pneumonia, caused by inhalation of fine soil particles and producing a lung condition similar to silicosis, killed an estimated 7,000 people, with historians suggesting the actual toll was higher due to rural underreporting. Approximately 3.5 million people were displaced, the largest internal migration in American history to that point. The topsoil destroyed during the Dust Bowl years will not regenerate within any time frame meaningful to human civilization. Soil formation rates in the region are estimated at approximately 1 inch per 500 years. The Dust Bowl resulted directly in the establishment of the USDA Soil Conservation Service in 1935 and the development of soil conservation practices that are now standard in agricultural science. The topsoil that feeds a continent took thousands of years to form and was destroyed in decades. It is not coming back. The Dust Bowl is not a historical event that ended. It is a permanent alteration of the land, and the only question is how carefully the lesson is applied to what remains. 24. Two ships collide in a harbor in 1917. A fire breaks out on one of them. The fire department is called. This is, apparently, a manageable situation. On December 6, 1917, in Halifax Harbor, Nova Scotia, the French cargo ship SS Mont Blanc was carrying 2,925 tons of explosive material, including benzol, gun cotton, TNT, and picric acid, en route to France for military use in World War I. The SS Emo collided with it in the narrows connecting the harbor to the basin. The Mont Blanc caught fire immediately from the collision. The crew, knowing what the ship was carrying, abandoned it and attempted to warn the shore, but the combination of language barriers and the chaos of the moment prevented effective communication. Many Halifax residents gathered on the waterfront and in windows to watch what appeared to be a spectacular harbor fire. At 9:04 and 35 seconds in the morning, the Mont Blanc detonated. The explosion generated temperatures estimated at approximately 5,000 degrees Celsius at its center, created a supersonic pressure wave, and produced a harbor wave approximately 18 meters tall. It was the largest man-made explosion in history to that point, a record it held until nuclear weapons. The explosion was heard 150 miles away. It registered as a seismic event at stations across eastern North America. It flattened the Richmond district of Halifax, almost completely. A 47-acre section of the city was entirely destroyed. The deck gun barrel from the Mont Blanc was found 5.6 kilometers from the detonation point. The death toll was approximately 2,000, with roughly 9,000 injuries. A significant proportion of the eye injuries were caused by observers watching the fire through glass windows at the moment of detonation. The blast wave shattered the glass and drove fragments into the eyes of people standing inside their homes, watching something interesting outside. The following night, Halifax experienced one of the worst blizzards in its recorded history. hampering rescue operations for survivors sheltering in rubble. Halifax's annual gift of a Christmas tree to Boston, which continues to this day, commemorates the relief aid Boston sent in response to the disaster. 25. The Monongah Mine disaster in West Virginia on December 6, 1907, killed somewhere between 361 and 500 people. And the reason that range exists is one of the most revealing details in the history of American industrial accountability. The Fairmont Coal Company's official death toll was 361, based on payroll records. Payroll records listed only the primary wage earner for each household. It was standard practice in the era for miners to bring additional family members into the mines to assist with loading coal, since miners were paid by the ton they extracted rather than by the hours they worked. Wives, older children, and younger siblings entered the mines and appeared in no employment documentation. The U.S. Bureau of Mines, established in 1910, partly in direct response to Monongah, later estimated the actual death toll could have been as high as 500 or more. The precise number of people who died in mines number 6 and number 8 that morning has never been established and cannot be established now. The explosion itself was caused by igniting accumulated methane and coal dust. The exact ignition source never definitively determined. The blast affected 96% of Monongah's adult male workforce. The social destruction was functionally total. Approximately 250 women were widowed in a single morning. An estimated 1,000 children lost their fathers. The community, which had been an economically functional town, effectively ceased to operate as one. Rescue operations became body recovery operations within a very short time frame, because the explosion and subsequent fires made survival of anyone in the mines at the time of detonation essentially impossible. The Monongah disaster, combined with a series of other major mine explosions in 1907, the worst single year for American mining fatalities in recorded history, directly drove the creation of the Bureau of Mines. In 1907, more than 3,200 American coal miners died in work-related accidents. That figure was a known, accepted, annually expected industrial cost. Monongah attracted public attention that the accumulated individual statistics had consistently failed to generate. The company's records could not tell investigators how many people died because they had never counted the ones they were not paying. 26. A railway bridge collapse in Ohio in 1876. A terrible accident. Engineers investigate. New safety measures are adopted. The railway rebuilds. The historical record files it appropriately. The Ashtabula Bridge disaster on December 29, 1876 was all of those things, plus one detail that makes it something considerably more specific. The bridge over the Ashtabula River in northeastern Ohio had been designed by Charles Collins, the Lakeshore and Michigan Southern Railway's chief engineer. Collins had conducted the most recent structural inspection of the bridge approximately 2 weeks before it collapsed and had certified it structurally sound. When the bridge gave way as a passenger train crossed it during a severe snowstorm, the train fell approximately 75 feet into the ravine below. The wooden passenger cars, heated by stoves, caught fire immediately after impact. 92 people died. 64 survived. Many of the dead were killed not by the fall, but by the fire, because rescue operations were severely hampered by storm conditions, and several injured survivors who could not move died in the burning wreckage before help could reach them. The subsequent investigation examined Collins's own notes and correspondence, and found evidence suggesting he had been aware of structural concerns about the bridge for years and had chosen not to act on them. The post-collapse investigation revealed significant design flaws in the bridge's iron construction that produced stress concentrations well beyond what the material could sustain. 2 months after the disaster, Collins died by suicide. Among the confirmed dead was P.P. Bliss, a prominent gospel songwriter whose works were widely known throughout the United States at the time. His body was never recovered from the wreckage. The Ashtabula disaster was one of the most extensively examined railway accidents in 19th century American history, and contributed to the development of federal railway bridge inspection standards. The bridge that killed 92 people had been inspected and certified safe 2 weeks earlier by the man who designed it, who then died before the investigation could formally question him. The structure, apparently, was not the only thing that failed under examination. 27. Chicago's brand new Iroquois Theater opened to the public in October of 1903. The promotional materials described it as absolutely fireproof. It was considered architecturally magnificent, technically advanced, and properly equipped for public safety. It had been open for 5 weeks on December 30th, 1903, when a 16-year-old busboy lit a match in a basement lounge to see while changing a light bulb, and the artificial palm tree nearby ignited. 602 people died, making it the deadliest single-building fire in American history. The absolutely fireproof designation was accurate in a strictly structural sense. The steel and concrete of the building did not burn. The interior of the building was another matter entirely. Velvet draping, painted canvas stage backdrops, fabric seating, and decorative wall treatments throughout the venue were entirely flammable, and the fire moved through them at a rate that multiple witnesses described as instantaneous. A stage crew member fleeing through a large stage door created a massive draft that sent a wall of fire directly into the seating area. The theater had 27 exits, many of which were unknown to the actors and stagehands who had not been briefed on emergency procedures for a building they had worked in for 5 weeks. Audience exits led into unfamiliar corridors rather than directly to the street. Some opened onto elevated platforms with no stairs. Bodies were found stacked behind locked exit doors fitted with European-style bimetallic lock mechanisms that panicking crowds, unfamiliar with the design, could not operate. The theater held an estimated 1,724 people that afternoon, significantly above its legal capacity for a holiday matinee. Performer Eddie Foy stayed on the stage attempting to calm the audience, while fellow performers fled, and is widely credited with preventing an even higher toll. He survived. 602 people did not. The Iroquois Theater fire produced comprehensive fire code revisions within months that became a national model, including requirements for clearly marked outward opening exits, mandatory fire curtain inspection, and maximum occupancy enforcement. The building was fireproof. Every person inside it was not, and nobody had thought to treat those as separate considerations until after 602 people demonstrated the distinction. 28. On the night of October 8, 1871, the Great Chicago Fire began and killed approximately 300 people, destroyed roughly 17,000 structures, and became one of the most famous disasters in American history. On the same night, in the logging country of northeastern Wisconsin, a fire killed somewhere between 1,500 and 2,500 people, and is remembered by almost no one. The Peshtigo fire ignited in conditions created by the same regional weather system that contributed to the Chicago disaster. Severe drought, high winds, and months of accumulated dry/debris left over from logging operations covering the ground across vast areas. What burned in Peshtigo was not a typical forest fire. Fire historians classify it as a firestorm, a self-sustaining fire-generated weather system that creates its own wind patterns and can move faster than any conventional evacuation can respond to. Eyewitness accounts describe a roaring sound audible miles away, flames appearing to move faster than horses could run, and the air itself seeming to ignite. The town of Peshtigo, with approximately 2,000 residents, was destroyed in approximately 1 hour. Virtually no structure survived. Residents who fled to the Peshtigo River described the water becoming so crowded that movement was impossible. Confirmed deaths in the town alone were approximately 800. Deaths across the 12 communities affected in the broader region are estimated at 1,500 to 2,500. The true number cannot be established because entire families were incinerated with no survivors to report them missing. The Great Chicago Fire killed approximately 300 people. Peshtigo killed 5 to 8 times as many people on the same evening and received minimal national press coverage because Chicago was a larger city with more prominent residents and a more dramatic rescue narrative. Federal aid to the Peshtigo region was slow, in part because charitable resources were concentrated on Chicago. Governor Lucius Fairchild traveled to Washington personally to request assistance. The Peshtigo fire is now studied as the definitive historical example of wildland firestorm behavior and is referenced in modern wildfire modeling. The deadliest fire in American history happened on the same night as a much more famous fire, and history covered the smaller one. 29. The MGM Grand Hotel and Casino Fire in Las Vegas on November 21st, 1980, began on the ground floor in a restaurant and killed 85 people, most of whom were on floors 20 through 26 and never saw flames. The fire started in the casino's deli restaurant, spread rapidly through the large, open, connected casino floor via flammable interior materials, and consumed the ground level of the building within minutes. The casino and certain lower floor sections had been constructed without fire suppression systems in specific areas, a decision made partly on grounds that sprinkler chemicals would affect food and beverage operations, and partly on cost. The building had been constructed before Nevada adopted more stringent fire codes. The fire did not need to reach the upper floors. Heat and smoke moved through elevator shafts, stairwells, and the HVAC system, filling upper floor corridors and guest rooms with toxic gases. Guests on the highest floors died in their rooms from smoke inhalation while seeing no fire whatsoever. They were visible from the street and from news helicopters standing on window ledges and balconies, many of them rescued by helicopter, others dying before rescue arrived. The event revealed a systemic communication failure. Many guests were unaware of evacuation procedures, exit locations, or that an emergency was occurring until smoke had already filled their corridors. The hotel's internal emergency communication system was inadequate to reach all guests in the building effectively. 85 deaths total. The MGM Grand Fire became a direct catalyst for Nevada's comprehensive revision of fire codes, including retrofit requirements for sprinkler installation in existing high-rise structures. This requirement faced significant industry opposition on grounds of cost before being enacted. The fire also materially contributed to changes in federal hotel fire safety recommendations that subsequently affected high-rise buildings nationwide. The fire never reached the floors where most people died. A fire on the ground floor of a building is a fire on every floor of a building if the smoke has a path upward, and 85 people demonstrated that principle at the MGM Grand while the lobby burned 30 stories below them. 30. On March 11th, 2011, a magnitude 9.0 earthquake struck off the coast of northeastern Japan, the most powerful earthquake in Japan's recorded history. The Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant's seawall had been designed for a maximum wave height of 5.7 meters. The tsunami that arrived was approximately 14 meters. The earthquake triggered an automatic emergency shutdown of the plant's reactors, which was correct procedure. Reactors that have been shut down continue producing decay heat from ongoing radioactive processes for weeks and require continuous active cooling to prevent a meltdown. Emergency diesel generators were designed to provide electrical power for the cooling systems if the external grid failed. The generators were located in the basement. The tsunami flooded the basement. All generators failed simultaneously. Battery backup systems provided approximately 8 hours of power. Within those 8 hours, operators were unable to restore power or cooling through any available means. 3 of the 6 reactor units experienced fuel melt. Hydrogen explosions destroyed the outer containment structures of Units 1, 3, and 4. Approximately 154,000 residents were evacuated from the surrounding exclusion zone. No deaths directly attributable to radiation exposure have been confirmed. The evacuation itself caused approximately 2,200 stress-related deaths, predominantly among elderly residents displaced from care facilities and familiar environments. World Health Organization and International Atomic Energy Agency assessments identified increased thyroid cancer rates among children in the most heavily affected areas, findings that remain subject to scientific debate regarding causality and the effects of screening practices that were not previously applied to the population. Post-Fukushima analysis by nuclear regulatory agencies worldwide identified the backup system vulnerability as a design flaw present at multiple facilities globally. Backup power systems, stored at the same elevation as primary systems, vulnerable to the same failure mode in a compound disaster. International nuclear safety standards were subsequently restructured to require backup system diversification and elevation separation. multiple redundant backup systems were installed to prevent the failure of the primary system. All of them were in the same basement. When every failsafe fails for the same reason at the same time, the redundancy was never real. It was the appearance of redundancy, which in a nuclear facility is a distinction that costs approximately 154,000 people their homes. 31. The S.A. Andre Arctic Balloon Expedition of 1897 was the most glamorous adventure of its era. Swedish engineer Salomon August André and two companions departed from Svalbard on July 11th, attempting to fly a hydrogen balloon to or across the North Pole. The press coverage was global. The participants were serious, credentialed scientists. The technology was the most advanced available for the attempt. Contact was lost almost immediately after departure. The fate of the expedition was unknown for 33 years. In 1930, a Norwegian scientific expedition to White Island, known as Kvitøya, discovered the camp, equipment, skeletal remains, and undeveloped photographic film belonging to the André party. The film, exposed to decades of Arctic conditions, was successfully developed and produced clear, detailed photographs of three men on the ice after their landing, smiling, appearing to be in reasonable physical condition, with no visible indication of how close they were to dying. André's diaries, also recovered intact, provided a day-by-day account of what had happened. The balloon had come down after approximately 65 hours of flight, having traveled roughly 475 miles. The three men then walked across pack ice toward land for months, dragging their equipment. They reached White Island in October of 1897 and died there within days of arrival. The cause of death was debated among researchers for decades. The most strongly supported current theory, first advanced in a 1952 medical analysis and subsequently supported by food science researchers, is trichinosis from undercooked polar bear meat. Trichinella parasites are endemic to polar bears in the high Arctic region. The symptoms documented in the final diary entries and the physical condition described in those entries are consistent with trichinosis. The three men ate undercooked polar bear and died of a parasitic disease months after their balloon came down, while their cameras recorded the entire preceding journey in photographs that would not be seen by anyone for 33 years. André and his companions were not reckless. They were the most prepared people their civilization could produce for what they attempted. They were undone by something their era's science had not yet connected to the specific context they were in. The cameras outlasted everyone who knew what they were photographing. If you want to see more, click the video on screen now